The train wheezed to a stop at Silverton in the last light of August, and Ara Bowen descended onto a platform of weathered planks with nothing in her hands but a canvas grip and everything gone from inside her chest. The mountain air hit her differently than the coal-thick fogs of the Rhondda Valley. Thinner, colder despite the season, carrying a mineral taste that reminded her of her father's hands when he came home from the deep places. She was 32 years old. She had been married 14 years and widowed 3 months. Her daughters were in Swansea with her sister, safe, boarded, paid for with the last money from Thomas's insurance and the sale of their chapel plot. She had come west because a miner's widow in Wales was a thing pitied and discarded in equal measure, and she could not bear the weight of other people's sorrow pressing down on her alongside her own. The mountains looked like something carved from hard truth. She recognized them immediately, the way a woman recognizes her own bone structure in her daughter's face. The town sprawled at the base of the San Juan Range like something that had settled there briefly and might leave any season. False-fronted buildings and sagging roofs, the main street wide enough for wagons, and dust enough to cover everything in a fine gray skin. There was a general store and a saloon and a boarding house that sat back from the street with the air of something that had seen too much. Ira made her way toward it, her boots striking the boards with the sound of purpose, though her hands trembled slightly against the canvas grip. The boarding house keeper was a woman named Merle Hutchins, broad-faced and iron-haired, who looked at Ira's Welsh accent and the cut of her clothes and the absence of a ring as though calculating the sum of her problems. $3 a night, she said, and no trouble with men. And Ira paid for a week in advance with coins that seemed to weigh her hand down toward the earth. The room smelled of old tobacco and older longing. She lay on the narrow bed, with her boots still on, and listened to the sounds of the town settling into evening. Saloon laughter, a distant hammer, someone calling to someone else in that familiar register of human need. By the second week, she understood that Silverton did not want her. She had tried the claims office, thinking to learn what work might be done, but the man behind the desk barely glanced at her and said all claims were filed or pending, nothing for a woman and nothing for a foreigner besides. She had tried 2 restaurants looking for work as a cook, but the owners looked past her as though she had not spoken. She had asked after rental cabins, small places on the outskirts where she might live cheaply while she found her footing, but every inquiry ended the same way. The properties were not available, or they had been promised elsewhere, or the price was quoted at such a height that it was clearly not meant for her. There was a library, a small room attached to the church, and there she found a woman named Catherine who worked among the books with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being overlooked. And Catherine had been kind in the way that the invisible are kind to one another, speaking to her about geology books and the structure of mountains, about what one might learn if one paid attention to the way the earth arranged itself. Catherine had slipped her a slim volume about alpine flora and another about the mineral composition of stone, and Ira had read them in her narrow boarding house room while the night deepened beyond the window, remembering her father's voice explaining the seams and layers of coal, the way he could taste the age of stone, could predict water runs and cave-ins by listening to what the rock told him. It was Catherine who had suggested carefully that there was perhaps more freedom in not trying to belong to the town at all, that the mountains themselves were a kind of home if one knew how to read them. Era had understood what was being offered, a permission slip written in kindness, an exit from the exhausting work of being refused. She had sold her boarding house room for the week remaining and bought supplies instead: flour and salt and a coffee can of lard, a canvas tent, rope, a hatchet, and on a morning when the light came down clean and unobstructed through the peaks, she had walked into the mountains with her pack and her father's memory and the knowledge that in the deep places, at least, she had always known what to do. The altitudes near Silverton rose in stages: dark green, giving way to scattered pine, and then to open meadows that seemed to roll toward the sky itself. She walked for 2 days, sleeping in the tent, drinking from streams that ran silver and cold. She had learned patience in the mine villages, the way to move slowly and listen to what the land was telling her. And she followed the high passes where the wind moved differently, where the air grew thin and the views opened to show her the depth and complexity of the world. On the 3rd day, in a basin between 2 peaks where the glacier hung like a permanent winter, she felt it, a strange warmth rising from the ground, the kind of thing most people would miss entirely, a breath of air that seemed to come from below rather than above. She knelt and pressed her hand to the gray stone and felt it, definite as heartbeat, the warmth of deep places touching her palm like recognition. She had stood there for a long time, feeling the years of her life arrange themselves around this single moment, this strange gift of warmth in the high cold places where such things had no right to exist. The glacier's entrance was a collapsed arch of ice and stone, a natural opening that faced south and down toward the lower valleys. She had to crouch to enter it, pushing through a veil of ice crystals that clung to her shawl, and the passage opened almost immediately into a chamber that took her breath away. It was perhaps 30 feet across and 20 feet at the highest point of the arched ceiling, the walls smooth and blue-white, with the transparency that pure ice has when it has been compressed for 1,000 years. And everywhere, the blue-white ice seemed to pulse with an inner light. The floor was stone, dark basalt or some similar ancient rock, and it was warm to the touch, unnaturally warm, and she could feel the heat radiating up from somewhere beneath it, some deep spring of thermal energy that the earth was generous enough to share. The air inside was not cold at all, but rather cool in the way a spring cellar is cool, that perfect temperature for preservation and storage. She could see her breath, just barely, and then only at the entrance where the outside cold was creeping in. The light filtering through the ice walls was blue and dreamlike, and it occurred to her with a strange clarity that she had come home to a place she had not known she was searching for, a place that answered something in her that had been shaped by 14 years of living in the hollowed-out darkness beneath the earth, learning to trust the stone and the mineral logic of deep places. She had gone back to Silverton that evening and bought more supplies, carefully, without drawing attention, picking items from the general store in a scattered way over 3 days. A small cast-iron cook stove that the clerk had marked as a damaged return for half price, a length of stovepipe, nails, hinges, rope in coils, canvas, a Dutch oven, a coffee pot, salt pork in a tin, dried beans in paper packets, The storekeeper took her money without comment and did not ask questions, which was the custom of mountain men who understood that people came west to escape scrutiny as much as poverty. She had also visited an old carpenter named Schultz who worked on the edge of town, a man who was himself something of an outsider, German and reticent and seemingly at peace with solitude, and she had hired him to cut timber and frame out shelves and supports, telling him she was building a cabin in the high country, paying him in advance so that he would not ask too many questions. He had set to work with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped trying to understand the choices of others. She had carried the cut timber up into the mountains in loads, 10 and 12 pieces at a time, sweating under the weight, her hands developing a familiar set of calluses that reminded her of her mother's hands, of the life she had lived before marriage had shuffled her into a different kind of story. By September, she had built the frame for a hearth at the entrance to the glacier chamber, using flat stones taken from the stream bed and a fire clay mixture that she had made by digging and testing different earth compositions until she found one that held. She had lined it carefully, building it up in rings like the rings of a tree, creating a space where she could burn wood safely without the smoke overwhelming the chamber. The ice walls protected her from wind, and she had discovered that if she positioned the hearth just right, the smoke would be drawn upward and out through a natural chimney in the ice ceiling, a vertical shaft that the glacier had formed centuries or millennia ago. She had watched the smoke rise and dissipate with a sense of wonder that she had thought was spent in her, worn away by grief and the long years of doing practical things in dark places. The stove would sit beside the hearth for cooking, and she had run the stovepipe up and out through the same chimney. And when she tested it with a small fire, the system worked with the kind of perfect logic that stone and fire had always shown her. By October, the glacier chamber had begun to look less like a cave and more like a home. She had lined the walls in certain places with canvas to insulate them slightly, not because it truly changed the temperature, but because it softened the absolute ice whiteness, gave the space a sense of interior life. The shelves that Schultz had built stood in neat rows along the western side, and she had begun to stock them with the seriousness of a woman preparing for siege. There were glass jars of preserves that she had made from the wild berries that grew in the high meadows, huckleberries and thimbleberries and wild raspberries that she had picked with the patience of someone who knew how to gather. There were jars of rendered lard and rendered beef fat for cooking, sealed with cloth and wax. There were wheels of cheese that a rancher's wife in a settlement to the north had sold her, hard, dry cheeses that would keep. There were tins of condensed milk, boxes of salt crackers, paper packets of dried herbs, sage and thyme and basil that she had hung and dried herself, spreading them on canvas in a lean-to shelter she had built outside the main chamber. There were smoked meats hanging in canvas bags from hooks in the ceiling, the venison and elk that a hunter had sold her, the smell of smoke and salt and preservation hanging in the cool air. There were potatoes and turnips and onions stored in clay pots, the earth roots that had fed her through Welsh winters, and she had packed them in sand to keep them dormant and fresh. There were bags of flour and cornmeal, salt in a sealed container, a small precious tin of real butter that she rationed carefully, coffee in another sealed tin, tea in paper wrappings, sugar in a glass jar. She had built it all with the knowledge of a woman who had grown up understanding scarcity, who knew the mathematics of making something stretch across the long, hungry months, who understood preservation and storage the way other people understand language. The bedding had taken her weeks to assemble. She had bought wool blankets at the general store, 2 of them, dark gray and heavy enough to hold warmth. She had saved money and bought a bearskin from a trapper who came through Silverton in early autumn, a massive pelt that weighed nearly as much as she did, and she had spent an entire day arranging it on the wooden frame she had built for a bed, positioning it so that the fur faced up and the whole thing looked like something between cave den and civilization. She had also bought a quilt at a church fundraiser made by women's hands over long winters, patterned in a careful checkerboard of red and blue, and she had layered it over the furs and blankets until the bed looked like something that promised warmth and rest in the way that few places on earth truly did. The pillows she had filled herself, with wood shavings at first and then later with milkweed down that she had collected from the high meadows in late summer, beating it out of the pods and sewing it into cloth covers that she had made from old fabric. She had positioned the bed at the back of the chamber, on the warmest section of the stone floor, where the geothermal heat rose most strongly and where the body's own warmth could accumulate and reflect off the ice walls in a kind of doubled security. There were other things, smaller things, that nonetheless mattered in a way that was difficult to articulate. She had brought her father's Bible, and it sat on a small shelf, bound in cracked leather, with passages marked in his precise hand. She had brought a small wooden cross that he had carved before he died, no more than 3 inches tall, carved from Welsh oak in the evenings before the mine took him away each morning, and she had hung it above the head of her bed. She had brought the iron kerosene lantern that had been her mother's, with its curved wire handle and its glass panels that could be adjusted to direct light in specific directions, and she had filled it with kerosene and hung it from a hook above her bed, where it could cast a warm glow at night. She had found, in the abandoned mining camp 2 valleys over, a small mirror, tarnished and speckled, and she had hung it near where she washed herself in the mornings, using the cold water from the stream at the base of the glacier and warming it slightly in a tin pot over the fire. She had sewn small cloth pouches and filled them with dried herbs, lavender and chamomile and mint, and hung them around the chamber so that the air held the faint memory of growing things, so that the purely mineral smell of ice and stone was softened by the green scent of plant life. By late October, Silverton had fully absorbed the knowledge that Era Bowen was living inside a glacier. How they had discovered this, she never entirely understood, though she suspected that Merle Hutchins, the boarding house keeper, had mentioned her departure with the kind of tone that raised questions, and from questions the story had grown until it had taken on the character of certainty. The townspeople called her the Glacier Woman, and sometimes, when they thought she could not hear, the Ice Witch, as though living in a place of ice was a kind of magic, and magic was a kind of transgression against the natural order of things. She saw it in the way they looked at her when she came to town for supplies, a mixture of pity and revulsion and a strange kind of fascination. The women seemed particularly affronted, as though her choice had called into question the choices they had made, as though by refusing to build a proper cabin and anchor herself to the land in the way that civilization demanded, she had committed some kind of theft against the community. The men, by and large, seemed to view it as either insanity or a kind of stubborn resistance that was somewhat admirable, even if it was also ridiculous. There was a preacher who had sought her out in mid-October, finding her at the general store and addressing her with the kind of intensity that suggested he had been praying about what to do with her, and he had told her that what she was doing was contrary to God's intention for women, that the home was meant to be a place of human construction and human arrangement, not a cave in the earth, no matter how warm it was. She had listened to him politely and said nothing, and when he had finished, she had simply bought her supplies and left, and she had never gone back to his church, though she still read her father's Bible every evening by the light of the kerosene lantern. There was a particular mockery that attached itself to her, the kind of social fiction that a small town creates and passes around like currency. She was not married, therefore she was unsafe, therefore her choices were suspect. She was living alone, therefore she was either desperate or deluded or both. She was living in a glacier, a thing that was not a house and not a tent and not a mine. Therefore she was living contrary to sense and propriety and the way that civilization had arranged itself. The saloon keepers and shopkeepers and the wives who gathered to gossip in the streets seemed to treat her story as a kind of entertainment, a proof that the mountains were still wild enough to drive a woman to strangeness, that you could not live in a place like this without some damage being done to the orderly arrangements of society. She had heard them repeat stories about her that had no basis in anything she had said or done, that she had gone mad after her husband died, that she was hiding something, that she was practicing witchcraft or grave robbing or some other transgression against decency. She had learned over the weeks of October not to listen to these stories, or rather to listen to them the way she listened to the wind, as something that moved through the world according to its own logic and had nothing to do with her actual life. What they did not see, because they were not looking, and because the glacier was a long climb away from everything they understood as home, was the order and care that she was creating inside that ice-walled chamber. They did not see the way she kept her shelves organized with the precision of someone who had spent her life understanding that organization was a kind of prayer, a way of acknowledging the gifts that the earth provided. They did not see the small brass bell that she had hung by the entrance, salvaged from an old mission, which rang in the wind and told her when weather was coming down from the peaks. They did not see the way she had woven grass and small branches into a tight mat at the entrance, so that when she came in from outside, she could wipe the mud from her boots and not track dirt across the stone floor. They did not see the care with which she kept the fire going, banking it at night and bringing it back to life in the morning with the efficiency of someone who knew that fire was life in the high places. They did not see the way she had marked the days in a small leather journal, keeping track of the weather and the temperature fluctuations, and the behavior of the animals in the high meadows, noticing things, building knowledge, using the long hours of solitude to become intimate with the world in a way that most people never manage. They did not see the way she had begun to develop an understanding of the glacier's moods, learning when the ice was expanding and contracting, learning to listen to the creaks and groans and pops that the vast formations of frozen water made as they moved with the seasons, learning to read the place the way her father had read the coal seams. By November, the first serious snow had come, and then had passed, and the world above the glacier had settled into the pattern of autumn turned toward winter. The aspens had gone from green to gold to bare, and the evergreens stood dark against the snow. Era's supplies were fully stocked, and she had begun the work of pure survival preparation that becomes necessary when you are living in a place where winter can last longer than it lasts elsewhere. She had found a natural water source inside the glacier chamber, a small seep that came from somewhere deep below the ice, and she had channeled it into a barrel where it stayed cold and clean and available. She had built a small privy at the entrance, hidden behind a natural outcrop of stone, with privacy assured by the canvas she had strung and the distance from the main chamber. She had made certain that her wood supply was sufficient, cords of it stacked and seasoned, and she had learned how to position the timber in the hearth so that the fire would burn cleanly and draw properly through the chimney. She had also, in late October, found an old lantern from the mining camp, a carbide lamp that burned hotter and brighter than the kerosene, and she had filled its reservoirs and tested it carefully, but she saved it for true emergencies, preferring the softer light of the kerosene and the firelight from the hearth. It was late November when the first real blizzard came, the kind of storm that the high country produced, moving in from the north with a weight and density that made the world itself feel like it was disappearing. Era had been watching the sky for 2 days, reading the way the clouds moved and the way the wind began to come from a direction that was contrary to the normal patterns, and she had seen the warning signs that her father had taught her to see, the kind of signals that the earth sends before it decides to remind people of their insignificance. She had taken her supplies down into the town the day before, selling some of the excess eggs from the chickens she had kept in a small shelter outside the glacier. Somehow, despite everything, her flock had thrived in the high altitude, and she had seen the way that the townspeople had smiled at her with a kind of superior amusement, as though her life was a kind of entertainment, a strange, small life unfolding in the mountains for their observation. The storekeeper had asked her if she thought she would be all right up there, with the kind of tone that suggested he expected her to admit that it was foolish, that she would be begging her way back into civilization any moment. She had said nothing in response except thank you, and she had taken her supplies and climbed back up the mountain, and by the evening the snow had begun. It had started as a gentle thing, the kind of snow that falls with the softness of benediction, covering the world in white and muffling the sounds of wind and movement. She had stood at the entrance to the glacier chamber and watched the snow fall, watched it accumulate on the gray stone and the sparse vegetation, watched it build itself into something significant and substantial. By morning, it had shifted. The wind had begun to move it, had begun to arrange it into drifts and patterns, and the sky had disappeared entirely into a kind of uniform whiteness that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. She had sealed herself inside the glacier, pulling the canvas that hung at the entrance more tightly, pushing felt and cloth into any gap where wind might enter. The fire had blazed high and bright, and the light from it had reflected off the ice walls in a way that seemed to make the whole chamber glow with a kind of inner warmth. She had made tea and sat with her journal and watched the snow continue to fall, visible through the compressed ice window that formed the front of the chamber, and she had felt a strange sense of peace, the kind of peace that comes when you have done everything you can to prepare, and the rest is beyond your control. Outside the chamber, the world had transformed into something that was neither land nor air, but rather a kind of chaos that existed between those states. The snow fell in sheets and curtains, and the wind drove it horizontally, and the temperature had begun to drop in a way that made it seem as though the entire world was being systematically drained of heat. In Silverton, far below the glacier and below the tree line and below the weather that was moving in from the north, people were beginning to realize that something serious was happening. The snow that had seemed pleasant in the morning had begun to accumulate with a kind of urgency that made people uneasy, and by midday, the businesses had begun to close and people had begun to hurry toward their homes. There was a desperation in the way they moved, a recognition that they had been careless, that they had assumed the pleasant fall weather would continue, that they had not done the preparations that living in a place like this required. The supplies that had seemed adequate had suddenly seemed insufficient. The cabins that had seemed secure had suddenly seemed fragile. The community that had seemed permanent had suddenly seemed contingent on weather that was no longer cooperating with their plans. By evening, the blizzard had developed into something truly dangerous, a storm that was moving with a kind of intelligence and malice, burying the roads and the paths and making it impossible for anyone to leave the town or to bring supplies in. The snow had drifted against the buildings, and the wind had achieved a kind of howl that sounded almost sentient, that seemed to be testing every structure, every seal, every assumption about safety and shelter. The thermometer on the side of the general store had fallen to 15 degrees below zero, and the wind chill that the gusts created pushed the effective temperature to 30 or 40 below, the kind of temperature at which human flesh began to fail quite quickly, at which breath froze in the lungs, at which the world became simply uninhabitable. Inside the glacier chamber, Era had gathered her provisions and her comfort items. She had made sure that the fire was built up and ready for a long burn. She had brought the wood supplies inside and stacked them carefully. She had filled every container she had with water from the seep, anticipating that if the cold intensified, accessing water might become difficult. She had prepared food, bread and cheese and cold meat and dried fruit and nuts, and arranged it in reach of where she would likely spend the most time. She had taken her kerosene lamp and filled it completely. She had gathered every blanket and fur and cloth that she owned and arranged them on and around her bed, creating a nest of warmth that could sustain her through hours or days if necessary. She had done everything that her father had taught her to do when facing a storm in the high places, and she had settled in to wait. The storm continued for 3 days and 3 nights, and during that time, the world outside the glacier existed in a state of almost complete suspension. Inside the ice chamber, Ira existed in a state of perfect security. The fire burned steadily, fed by the wood that she had gathered and organized. The warm stone floor beneath her sent heat up through her body in a way that made her feel almost blessed by the earth itself. The ice walls, so transparent and beautiful in normal light, became opaque in the storm, pure white, and she realized that the snow was piling up against the entrance, creating an additional layer of insulation, a buffer between her and the chaos outside. She read her father's Bible, she wrote in her journal, she made tea and ate her prepared food with the deliberation of someone who understood that consumption was both nourishment and meditation. She slept deeply and without fear, wrapped in furs and wool, the kerosene lantern hanging above her, casting its warm light onto the ice ceiling, creating a kind of cave church at the heart of the storm. She thought, during those 3 days, about the people in Silverton below, and she wondered if they were afraid, if they understood now that they had miscalculated, that they had assumed safety where there was only exposure, that they had relied on assumption instead of on the kind of careful preparation that the mountains demanded. And she thought about her own choices, the way that those mockeries and dismissals had led her toward this place, this perfect shelter that most people would never have the imagination to discover. And she felt something that might have been vindication, but which felt more like a kind of quiet rightness, as though everything that had happened to her, all of the loss and displacement and ridicule, had been moving her toward this moment, toward this knowledge that she could survive what the world threw at her, that she had within her the capacity to read stone and fire and weather, that she belonged to the earth in a way that people who built their houses with only wood and nails never could. The wind that came down from the peaks on the 3rd day of December was not the wind of autumn descending into winter, but rather the voice of winter itself, speaking in a language older than the mountains and more terrible than mercy. It came in walls, in sheets, in a roar that seemed to shake the very stone of the world, and within 12 hours, the town of Silverton had vanished beneath a white so complete and absolute that a man standing at the center of Main Street could not see the buildings on either side of him. The temperature dropped 40 degrees between sunrise and noon, and by afternoon it had dropped another 20, until the very air seemed crystallized, each breath a knife drawn across the throat, each exhalation a ghost that froze and fell like glittering sand to the drifts below. Ira watched it come, standing in the entrance of her glacier cavern with her storm lantern held high, its amber light striking against the advancing wall of white, and she felt no fear, only a deep and abiding knowledge that she had been preparing for this moment since the day she first stepped into this hollow of ice and stone and began to make it home. Behind her, the cavern glowed with a warmth that seemed almost biblical in its sufficiency, the fire in the stone hearth burning steady and bright, the hanging herbs releasing their slow fragrance into air that was constant at 58 degrees, the shelves lined with mason jars of preserved fruit and vegetables, canned meats and pickled fish, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, rounds of bread stacked in the cool dark of the upper alcove where no predator could reach them, and beside them the butter churns, the oil cans, the sacks of dried beans and lentils and rice, the barrels of flour and salt, the hanging ropes of garlic and onion braids, the smoked hams wrapped in paper and hung from iron hooks driven deep into the rock. She had spent 8 months filling this cavern with the knowledge that survival was not a luxury, but a discipline, and discipline was the one thing a coal miner's daughter understood better than most. By the 4th day, when the town had been buried under 4 feet of snow and the temperature had not risen above 20 below zero, the first desperate face appeared at the entrance to her cavern, framed by wind and frost and the absolute whiteness of a world gone wrong. It was Thomas Hendricks, the merchant who had laughed loudest when Era first announced her intention to winter in the glacier, the man who had called her a fool and worse, a woman who had taken leave of her senses and would be dead before Christmas. And now here he stood, his beard caked with ice, his fine wool coat having done him no service whatsoever, his fingers beginning to show the telltale white of frostbite, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes when a man realizes that all his certainties have been lies. She didn't say, "I told you so." She did not smile, though she might have been forgiven for it. Instead, she simply stepped aside and gestured him inward with the calm of a woman who had always known exactly how this would unfold, and she said nothing as he stumbled past her toward the fire, his boots dripping snow onto her carefully swept stone floor, his whole body beginning to shake with the violent shivering that comes when a man's core temperature has begun to collapse, and his body is desperately trying to warm itself from the inside out. She hung his coat on the drying rack by the fire, gave him a blanket from her stores, a thick wool thing she had knitted herself in the long twilight evenings, and pressed a cup of hot broth into his hands, a broth made from beef bones and root vegetables and herbs, the kind of thing that no amount of money could purchase in Silverton, but that cost her only the patient tending of her garden and her fire and her time. Within an hour, she had rubbed warmth back into his fingers and toes with snow and then with dry cloth, and she had fed him bread and cheese and a thick slice of ham, and his shaking had begun to slow, and his color had begun to return, and in the amber light of her cavern, he looked like a man returned from the dead and already beginning to remember what the living world felt like. He wept, though he tried to hide it, and she pretended not to notice. By the end of that day, there were 5 townspeople sheltering in her cavern. By the end of the first week, there were 17. The blizzard did not stop. It intensified. There was something almost malevolent in the way it pressed against the entrance of the cavern, as though it were a living thing with intentions, with hunger, with a desire to drag everyone it could find out into its cold heart and hold them there until they froze into eternal stillness. The townspeople began to arrive in groups now, whole families huddled together, some of them delirious, most of them carrying almost nothing. A few blankets, some clothing that was already soaked through, perhaps a child or an elderly parent who could no longer walk on their own. There was Mrs. Catherine Wyatt, the school teacher who had sniffed when Era came to the school to pick up supplies, who had asked her in front of the entire class whether she thought she was eccentric or simply mad. Now Mrs. Wyatt sat wrapped in one of Era's wool blankets, her hair loose and drying by the fire, her 2 children asleep against her on either side, and she made no comment about eccentricity or madness, only stared into the flames with the expression of someone who had glimpsed something very close to her own ending and found it wanting. There was Dr. Merrick, the man who had advised her publicly that living in a glacier cavern would result in her death within the first month from cold and damp and the inevitable pneumonia that such a life would bring. And now he sat beside the fire, his medical bag beside him, tending to the frostbite cases that kept arriving, and he looked at Era every so often with an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been shame, or perhaps some impossible mixture of the two. There was Sheriff Dalton, a man Era had always respected, a man who had never mocked her, but who had told her quite clearly that he could not protect her if she insisted on doing something so foolish. And now he helped her organize the cavern, helped her manage the flow of people, helped her ration the food with the careful eye of a man who understood that there were now nearly 30 people depending on her judgment and her preparation. The geothermal warmth that had seemed so curious, so slightly untrustworthy when Era first discovered it, now revealed itself to be exactly what it was: a gift, a blessing, a kind of grace. The heat seeped through the rock floor in 3 distinct areas, warm in the air to comfortable levels, even when the temperature outside had dropped to 30, 40, 50 below zero. She had known to build her hearth in one of these warm zones, had known instinctively that the old Welsh knowledge her grandmother had taught her about reading stone and earth and finding its secrets would matter here. Now that knowledge was keeping 36 people alive. She moved through the cavern with a quiet authority that surprised even herself, checking on the elderly, making sure the children had enough to eat, ensuring that the blankets were distributed fairly, that the water was clean, that the fire never fell below a steady, hot burn. She had brought in snow to melt for drinking water, and she kept large ceramic pots positioned at the edges of the fire, where the heat would slowly warm the ice and turn it into something liquid and life-sustaining. She had carefully studied her provisions before the first refugees arrived, and she had made a calculation that she has kept entirely to herself, a calculation that her stores could feed everyone at her cavern at reduced rations for approximately 5 weeks. The blizzard had now been going for 9 days. The weather service in Denver, when it had last sent a telegram before the lines went down, had suggested that the storm might last another 2 to 3 weeks. She did not share this calculation with anyone. Instead, she simply began to cook, in a way that maximized the sustenance of her stores, that took the bones and turned them into broth, that used every part of everything she had, that made the most fill-in bread possible from her flour, that stretched a pound of butter across 36 people by using it carefully, sparingly, but never missing an opportunity to add it to something hot where it would distribute its richness throughout a meal. She cooked the way her grandmother had cooked during the bad winters in Wales, when the coal mines were closed and the wages had stopped, and there was nothing to do but wait and make what little existed seem like abundance. She boiled the tough dried apples with a pinch of sugar until they became soft and almost sweet. She made a kind of pottage from dried beans that had been soaked in warm water near the fire, adding salt and herbs and the last precious bits of smoked ham to create something that tasted like survival and smelled like home. The townspeople ate as though food had just been invented, as though they had never understood before what it meant to be warm and full at the same time, to sit in a place where the temperature never dropped below 50 degrees, where there was light from the fire and from the carefully positioned storm lanterns, where other people were alive and present, and not slowly freezing to death in abandoned buildings or in the snow-choked streets of a town that had become, very suddenly, a place of deadly cold and profound darkness. And they watched Era move through the cavern, watched her organize and prepare and maintain, and slowly, very slowly, the mockery that had characterized their view of her began to transform into something that might have been respect or gratitude, or perhaps the dawning realization that they had been wrong about her, profoundly and completely wrong, and that being wrong about a woman like that could have cost them everything. On the 12th day of the blizzard, a second storm came down from the peaks. This one was worse than the first. The wind speed increased to what Sheriff Dalton estimated at near 60 miles per hour, and the temperature dropped below zero so far that the mercury in his thermometer froze solid and became useless. The entrance to the cavern began to ice over, a slow accumulation of frozen moisture that meant Era had to go out into the storm twice a day to clear the opening and ensure that air could still flow into the cavern from the outside world. She wrapped herself in her heaviest clothing, tied her headscarf tight, took her storm lantern, and ventured out into cold so complete that each breath felt like taking glass into her lungs. She worked with her hands and with a piece of wood, breaking the ice as it accumulated, pushing it away from the entrance, and then she would retreat back into the warm amber embrace of her cavern and stand for a moment, just a moment in the heat, letting her body remember what warm felt like before she went about the business of checking on the people sheltering there, of tending the fire, of preparing the next meal. By the 15th day of the blizzard, her stores had been reduced to something that was becoming concerning. She still had flour, she still had beans, she still had root vegetables stored in the cool upper alcoves of the cavern, but the preserved meats were running low, the cheese was running low, the butter was nearly gone, and she was beginning to make calculations that involved some genuine arithmetic about how many weeks of diminished rations might stretch, until either the blizzard ended or the spring roads opened enough for supplies to be brought in from the lower elevations. She made a decision one evening when the cavern was quiet, when most of the townspeople were asleep, huddled together under the wool blankets that covered the floor of the cavern like snow itself, like a gentle accumulation of warmth and human closeness. She went to her private stores, to the small cache she kept in the upper cave that she had always thought of as hers, for the long silence of spring and summer when she might want to stay inside the glacier and read or think or simply exist in the space she had created. She took out the 3 remaining jars of the jam she had made from wild raspberries, precious, irreplaceable until next summer, and she took out the final wheel of the hard cheese that she had been aging since the early autumn, the one she had promised herself she would taste slowly and thoughtfully in the quiet months. She carried these down to the main fire, and she distributed them into the evening meal, incorporating them into a kind of bread pudding that she made with the last of her eggs, which she had kept preserved in a kind of salt and straw mixture in the coolest part of the cavern. And when the townspeople ate this meal, when they tasted the sweetness of the jam and the complex richness of the aged cheese, when they experienced for a moment the luxury of eating something that was clearly precious and being carefully rationed out, their eyes went very still and very thoughtful. Mrs. Wyatt, the schoolteacher, spoke after the meal, when the cavern had settled into the quiet rhythm of evening. She said that she understood now that she had been cruel without meaning to be, that she had assumed Era was a woman acting out some kind of romantic fantasy about solitude and nature, rather than a woman who was doing exactly what she had set out to do with careful intention and serious preparation. She said that she had spent the last 15 days of her life, the 15 days since she had been brought into this cavern, shaking and near death, understanding for perhaps the first time that courage was not something that announced itself loudly or performed for an audience, that it was something that looked very much like patience, like preparation, like a willingness to do the unglamorous and difficult work of making a home in a place that most people would consider uninhabitable. Thomas Hendricks, the merchant, said nothing aloud, but he helped Era carry water, helped her organize the sleeping areas, helped her in all the small ways that a person can contribute when they are living in someone else's home and eating someone else's food and surviving because of someone else's preparation and generosity. Dr. Merrick spent one evening explaining to her, with genuine humility, the errors in his medical reasoning, the assumptions he had made about temperature and moisture and respiratory disease that had been wrong, that had been disproven by the simple fact of her living, continuing to live, thriving in a space that by his calculations should have killed her within weeks. The blizzard broke on the 23rd day, not all at once, but gradually, the wind dying down, the snow falling more gently, the temperature beginning, very slowly, to rise. By the 25th day, the sun had come out for the first time in nearly a month, and the snow in the entrance to the cavern had begun to glisten, and Era stood at the entrance with her storm lantern in her hand, watching the light transform the ice walls into something that seemed made of diamonds, of amber and sapphire and gold, and she felt something release in her chest that she had not realized she had been holding tight. The townspeople began to leave gradually, as paths were cleared and the danger receded, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, returning them to the world of normal shelter and normal life. They left with their lives, with their limbs intact, with their families whole. They left with provisions that Era insisted they take, bread and preserved vegetables, dried meat and cheese, because she understood that gratitude without generosity is a hollow thing, and she wanted no one to leave her cavern believing that they had been treated poorly, that their rescuer had been begrudging in her care. Mrs. Wyatt embraced her before she left, and there were tears on the schoolteacher's face, and she said that she would ensure that the children in her class understood the story of Ira Bowen and her Glacier cavern, that they would understand that there were many kinds of courage, many ways to be strong, and that the most dangerous thing in the world was the assumption that one understood another person's choices before taking the time to truly see them. Thomas Hendricks offered her money offered her a parcel of land in Silverton, offered her help in building a proper cabin, offered her everything that a man who had been wrong could think to offer to a woman who had been right. She declined, quietly but firmly, the way one declines a gift that, however well-intentioned, simply does not fit. She said that she had built her home, that it was here, in this glacier, that the townspeople had thought so uninhabitable, and that she had no desire for a different one. She said that what she had needed from the town was respect, not restitution, and that she had received the respect she needed, and now there was nothing else she required. In the spring, when the last of the snow had melted from the lower elevations, and the world had begun the slow business of warming itself back to something resembling normalcy, Era stood at the entrance to her glacier cavern and watched the snow melt running down the mountain in rivulets of cold water, watched the light change from the harsh white of winter to the softer gold of approaching summer, and felt the warm air rising around her from the depths of the earth below, from the geothermal gift that had meant she was never truly afraid. The cavern behind her glowed with amber light, the fire burning steady on the stone hearth. The shelves restocked now with new provisions gathered from her careful cultivation, the hanging herbs releasing their familiar fragrance into air that was warm and constant, and hers. She had proven nothing that she had not already known about herself, that a Welsh miner's daughter understood stone and fire and earth, understood survival and homemaking, understood that the world would mock her for knowledge it did not possess until the moment it desperately needed that knowledge to stay alive. She stood in the entrance of her glacier cavern, warm light behind her and spring light ahead, and knew with absolute clarity that she needed nothing from the people of Silverton, that she had created something far more valuable than their approval or their land or their money, that she had created a home in a place where most people would have seen only ice and cold and impossible darkness. And in the quiet certainty of that knowledge, in the warmth that rose around her from the depths of the earth, in the light that fell on her auburn hair and illuminated the strong lines of her face, in the absolute peace of a woman who had built her own refuge and proven, beyond any doubt, that she was more than equal to the world she had chosen, Era Bowen smiled, and the world went on around her, and spring came in, and winter released its grip, and she remained exactly where she had always belonged,